It's One Nation Restorations, and we're restoring another American-made tool with American-made tools. The inventory of the parts we need to fix on this vintage Buckingham thread restorer tool are going to include a facelift on the front plate and the back of the housing, but the real reason we're doing this restoration is the rotary wheel and the teeth blades are dulled out from who knows how many years of use. Now, I realized this when I was trying to restore a Vulcan C-clamp with a 5/8" screw, so this project's going to be put on hold until the piece here is restored back to its glory days. The faceplate is held on to the body by 4 screws. The grooves and the scratches aren't going to require any filler or special sanding, so I'm going to show you how to tackle something like this later on in the video. This gives us our first look inside the thread restorer. In order to remove the 2 carriers, the handles need to be taken off, which are held on by 2 pins. I used a common nail to punch them out, but anything that doesn't flare the end is going to work. Once both handles are out, you'll need to get some leverage to torque the draw rod from the handle. I use an American-made awl here, but a nail would work or anything skinny enough to get in there. 4 pins with a threaded end hold the blades and the springs into the carrier. Once you unscrew them all the way, push them from the other side because the pins are held in with a good amount of pressure from the springs. The blades and the springs will need to be pried out with something small enough to get between them and the carrier, and you can see just how roached out these things look here. And the last piece left is the rotary carrier. The wheel is held in by a pin and a retainer on the end, and just like the blades, the wheel is completely dulled out. Now, I don't know the exact date of this piece or when it was manufactured, but I can tell you that it went for around $11 when it was purchased, just based on the pricing on the inside of the instructions. Now, its current price on their website is $285, and so when you adjust that for the percent of inflation, that puts this piece around 100 years old, give or take. Now, I find it fascinating that this company has not changed the design or any of the parts since its development. And the other thing that I find fascinating is that it is still made in the USA by Buckingham themselves. Pulling the last of the pieces from the Evapo-Rust solution, you can see that it's done its job again. It's about 10 times more expensive to use than vinegar or apple cider vinegar, but you don't have to neutralize it when you're finished when you're going to be painting or bluing any parts, so to me it's worth it. And we talked earlier about the faceplate getting some much needed cosmetic upgrades. I'm using a 220 grit sandpaper and that's it. I'm not trying to work it down to get out any pitting or scratching, and I'm not trying to take it higher to do any buffing. All I'm trying to do is get a factory silver/aluminum paint finish, so I used a sandable primer to get out any of the imperfections with a 2000 grit sandpaper. If you still have some low spots, you can hit it with another coat of primer and repeat this process. 1 round was enough for this piece to turn out as perfectly as it did, which I greatly appreciate after last week's 7 hours of sanding on the Rodak flat sander restoration. If you haven't seen it yet, look for the link at the end of this video or click on the description below. The body didn't need to go through the sandable primer stage. What little rust it had was taken away in the de-rusting solution earlier. I covered up the threads here because they were in great shape and I didn't want to have to clean them unnecessarily. The body took 2 coats of a primer and paint, and if you're trying to match the color, I went with a gray glacier. For only doing about 10 minutes worth of sanding and painting for this piece, it looks brand new. There were a couple times on this project where I had to peel back some of my restoration techniques because I know that this thing looked rugged the day it was sold at the store. That's the difference between a machine and a person making this. I brought out the sanding stone to start the restoration process on the wheel and the blades. The oil I used for the lubrication is a 3M. The wheel itself has a sharp angle but a long body, so I had to stay on the edge to sharpen it. The process is almost identical to how you'd sharpen a can opener, except for you don't have to take the can opener apart to sharpen it. I simulated the turn of the wheel with my fingers because you don't want to flatten out the blade in any way. It's actually way easier to sharpen the can opener because you don't have to go back and forth or rotate manually, just turn the handle. Next up is the blades. Before you start moving them around the stone, make sure you get the edge flat. If you take your time, you can feel it sit down on the stone. If you don't, you're going to create a new edge and it's going to be a nightmare to fix. And chances are, even if you do fix it, you're going to have to take off too much of the blade that it's not even going to stick out of the carrier anymore. I searched around the website and it doesn't look like they sell spare parts anymore. You used to be able to pick these up back from them. These blades are going to get a round of bluing, and even if you didn't use a sharpening stone, there's still oil and residue that has to be removed first or it won't take. Now, you can do this with denatured alcohol, acetone, or I used brake parts cleaner, and I don't know what's a combination of, but it always gets the job done for me. Now, I used an American-made Super Blue by Birchwood Casey, and they recommend that after you finish, you also brighten the area with a steel wool. Make sure you apply the bluing with something that can soak it up pretty well. I use these American-made foam brushes that I picked up from Ace Hardware Store, but you could use a brush as well. The other thing to consider is that you should never dip your brush into the bluing container. So you see that I've poured it into a separate container so that I don't contaminate it. Even though the bluing is reacting instantly with the bare metal, you need to let it sit and work for around 30 seconds before submerging it into cold water and then drying it off. The bluing does look a little bit different on parts that have been sandblasted, so keep that in mind depending on what your need is for your restoration piece and how you want it to look. The other thing that can affect how dark your bluing gets is how many coats you apply. Repeat the process and reapply as many times until you get your desired look. And keep in mind that I applied 2 rounds of bluing to get the final look for this piece. I did the teeth, wheel, and springs, but I almost put bluing on the handles. If you go back to how the handles looked out of the box, it appeared to have been blued at some time. Now, I couldn't find any proof that it came from the factory this way at any time. It's not how they currently look on their website or in the instruction sheet that was included in the box. One Nation Restorations is about restoring pieces back to their original state, not about modifying them. Here you're getting a good look at how dark one coat of bluing will be. This look is like a dark charcoal, which is why I went for a round 2. Now, you don't have to wait for a reapplication. As long as the parts are dry, you can go right into your second coat. If you found these tips on bluing helpful, click subscribe for more useful restoration tips. Once you reach your desired look through the extra coats, you'll need to lock the color in with one final step. After drying your pieces, you need to apply an oil and let it sit for 12 hours. Birchwood Casey has their own product that they use for it, but I use a 3M oil and get the same results. I don't know what they have in their recipe, but their description makes it sound like a penetrating oil. In these shots, you can really appreciate what the second coat has done for these parts. I think 95% of the project I use bluing for take in just 2 applications. It's now time for our comparison shots. There's no better way to appreciate the work you put into a restoration than by comparing the results to what it was before you started. The process of putting the rotary wheel carrier back together is up first. After getting the wheel lined up, drive the pin through with a soft mallet. The retainer will need some help getting seated onto the end of the pin, so you should feel it click in. The trickiest part of the assembly was getting the teeth and the springs to line up with the pinhole in the carrier. It's about 22 seconds of time in this video, but it was about 22 minutes in real time. I found it was helpful to put them all in at one time and then to make adjustments once they were close enough to being in the right place. I pushed an awl through each way before attempting to put the pin through. It's a simple design that hasn't changed since Buckingham started making these thread restorers back in the 1800s. These blades are ready to go back on and do some cutting. The same way you needed to apply some torque to remove the draw rod from the handle, put something through the pinhole to help. Remember that the draw rod has a left thread, so you're going to need to go the opposite way that you're used to for tightening the handle. Now, I used a little bit of grease here to aid with the installation of the handles. It's important to know that one of them is slightly longer than the other one. The short one is going to go to the blade carrier and the long one is going to go to the wheel carrier. Make sure that you drive the pin through so that it's flush on both ends, and don't hit it with something that's too blunt because you don't want to flare it out. Once you line up the hole from the top, look at the bottom of the housing and adjust the handle until the holes line up. Not doing this is an easy way to mess up the pin. It's your last look at the inside of the thread restorer for a while. It's a good idea to hit it with some oil before closing it up to prevent any rust from getting in. The faceplate has 4 polished screws to anchor it down to the body. I put some wax on these because it's really the only exposed part in the entire piece that's susceptible to rust right now. This project took about 10 hours to complete. My favorite part of this restoration was working on the blade carrier pieces. It isn't often that I get to use my sanding stones, and the longest part of this restoration was putting the blade carrier back together. Be on the lookout for that Vulcan C-clamp restoration showcasing this piece soon. It's been moved up the priority list effective today. We restored another American-made tool with American-made tools. See you next time.